Tonight's story is a chilling reminder that danger can appear where you least expect it. This is the story of Emma Carter, a young woman whose ordinary life in Chicago was about to take a terrifying turn. Emma Carter lived alone in a modest apartment on the 12th floor of a downtown building. Her life was routine but comfortable. Long hours at a marketing firm, evenings spent reading or watching television, weekends walking along Lake Michigan or visiting local cafes. Safety had always felt natural. Chicago was her home, and her apartment was her sanctuary. That sense of security would soon be shattered. It began with something small, almost imperceptible. One night, while preparing dinner, Emma felt the sensation of being watched. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination. Chicago streets were busy, lights flickered in neighboring buildings, and shadows moved in ways that often tricked the eye. But the feeling persisted. She paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and glanced toward the living room window. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure standing across the street in the dimly lit courtyard of the building opposite hers. Emma froze. It was just a silhouette, motionless, yet unmistakably human. Her heart raced. She strained her eyes, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She tried to rationalize it, maybe a neighbor or a passerby. Yet a seed of unease had been planted. The next day, Emma mentioned nothing to her friends or colleagues. She could not explain why the thought lingered so persistently, nor why a tiny moment could unsettle her so completely. But the seed of paranoia grew quickly. That evening, as she returned from work, she noticed something else, a subtle movement behind the same window across the street. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was enough to confirm that someone had been there. Over the next week, the encounters multiplied. Shadows appeared at odd hours, and lights in the apartment across from hers would flash inconsistently, as if signaling or observing. Emma began recording small notes about times she saw movement, attempting to detect a pattern. Fear mingled with curiosity. She wanted to understand what was happening, to reclaim her sense of control, but each day brought new, subtle evidence that she was being watched. Emma's routine started to fracture. She stopped walking alone at night, avoided the street courtyard when returning from the grocery store, and began checking the window before turning off lights in her apartment. Even small sounds, a creaking floorboard, the distant honk of a car, a cough from a neighbor, set her heart racing. The city that once felt alive and vibrant now seemed alive in a different, threatening way. Every person passing her window could be the watcher. Her first attempt to confront the anxiety failed. She leaned out slightly from the balcony one evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious figure. Instead, she saw only a dark, empty courtyard and the fading lights of a distant street lamp. A part of her wanted to call the police, yet another part hesitated, fearful that doing so might escalate whatever game had begun. Emma realized that fear alone was no longer her enemy. It was her constant companion. On Thursday night, the situation escalated. Emma returned from work to find her front door slightly ajar. The security chain had not been disturbed, and nothing was missing from the apartment. It was subtle but unmistakable. Someone had tested her boundaries. The watcher was no longer passive. The realization sent shivers down her spine. She felt vulnerable in a way she had never felt before. Her sanctuary had been violated without a trace of forced entry. In the following days, Emma began to notice other signs, objects slightly moved, faint footprints on her balcony, and the inexplicable sensation that someone was following her in the building. She installed a small security camera near the door and set her phone to record whenever motion was detected. That night, she reviewed the footage and froze. A shadow lingered across the living room window just for a moment, before vanishing into darkness. No sound, no movement, just the faint presence of someone who had been there. The watcher's presence became more deliberate. Emma received notes slipped under her door. They were cryptic. Phrases like, "I see you," or "Do not ignore me," written in careful printed letters. The handwriting suggested control and intelligence. Whoever was watching her was patient, calculating, and obsessed. Fear, once abstract, had become a tangible, constant pressure that made sleep elusive and thoughts scattered. Emma confided in her friend Leah, who suggested moving temporarily or contacting the authorities. But Emma hesitated. The watcher seemed too clever to be caught easily. Every day, her awareness sharpened. She studied the courtyard across the street, observed the comings and goings of neighbors, and tried to detect patterns in light and shadow. She began to anticipate when the watcher might appear, yet every prediction was uncertain, keeping her on edge constantly. One particularly dark evening, as rain streaked the windows and distant sirens echoed through the streets, Emma saw the watcher more clearly than ever. A figure stood across from her apartment, eyes fixed, posture deliberate. It was not casual observation, it was attention, deliberate and sustained. Emma's pulse surged. Her first instinct was to retreat. But another part of her, the part that had grown determined despite fear, picked up her phone and began filming. Every second seemed like an eternity. The watcher noticed. A faint gesture, almost imperceptible, confirmed that they were aware of being observed. Emma felt a mixture of terror and fascination. Whoever this was, they were not simply stalking aimlessly. They were engaged in a psychological game, and she had become the unwilling participant. Each day that passed heightened the tension, with every shadow now a potential threat, and every routine a potential vulnerability. By the end of the week, Emma's life had transformed. Simple tasks, once taken for granted, were now exercises in vigilance. Leaving the apartment, answering the phone, and even opening mail carried potential danger. The watcher had shown her that control and safety were fragile illusions, and that the line between observation and intrusion could be crossed silently, invisibly, and with chilling precision. And yet, amid the fear, Emma felt a spark of determination. She would not be paralyzed. She would learn, adapt, and prepare for whatever came next. The watcher had initiated a game, but she would play it on her own terms, however dangerous it might become. Emma's life had become a careful choreography of observation and avoidance. Every action was measured, every movement considered. She had installed a small security camera near her front door, examined the courtyard across the street meticulously, and began documenting every unusual occurrence. Yet despite her precautions, the watcher's presence intensified. Simple shadows became signals, subtle gestures became threats, and small, inexplicable events accumulated into a pattern that chilled her to the bone. It started with the windows. One evening, Emma returned from work to find the blinds in her living room slightly crooked, as though someone had been adjusting them from outside. Nothing else was out of place, but the message was clear. She was being observed, and the watcher was deliberately sending a signal. Emma felt a creeping sense of violation. The thought that someone had spent hours tracking her, studying her routines, unsettled her deeply. The following night brought another escalation. A note appeared under her door, folded carefully, with precise typed letters. "You cannot hide. I know your schedule." Emma's hands shook as she held it. Fear had once been abstract, but now it was tangible, intimate, and invasive. Whoever this person was, they had access to information she had assumed was private, and they were using it to manipulate her. Sleep became elusive. Emma found herself awake in the middle of the night, eyes darting to shadows, heart pounding at every sound. Even the hum of the refrigerator or the distant noise of a passing car made her jump. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor. Leah, concerned, urged Emma to call the police, to document everything, and even to consider temporarily leaving the apartment. But Emma hesitated. The Watcher had already proven their cunning. Every action carried risk. Even a police call could provoke a reaction, and she was unwilling to give the Watcher any advantage. In the days that followed, Emma's anxiety became a constant companion. She began noticing patterns. The lights in the building across the street would flicker in synchronization with her own routines, almost as if the Watcher was timing them deliberately. Footsteps outside her door occurred at odd intervals, and faint scratching sounds on the balcony suggested someone was testing her boundaries. Emma realized that she was no longer merely being watched. She was being studied. Her habits, her movements, and her reactions were data points in a game she had never agreed to play. One afternoon, Emma discovered a small camera, cleverly hidden in a smoke detector in her hallway. Her stomach turned. The Watcher's intrusion was no longer limited to external observation. They had penetrated her private space. Fear surged through her, but it was accompanied by resolve. She would not allow herself to be terrorized without understanding the extent of the threat. Carefully, she removed the device and stored it as evidence, vowing to uncover who was behind the intrusion. The Watcher's methods continued to evolve. A series of messages appeared, not just at her apartment, but through her digital devices. Emails with vague threats, texts indicating knowledge of her past conversations, and subtle references to events only someone close to her life could know. Each message was calculated to instill fear while demonstrating control. Emma recognized that the game had become psychological, designed to erode her confidence and make her doubt her own perceptions. At work, the intrusion began to affect her concentration. Meetings felt tense, as though she were being judged not only by colleagues, but by the unseen presence monitoring her every movement. She began double-checking emails, securing her computer, and avoiding discussions about personal matters. Even a casual conversation could be exploited by the Watcher. Emma realized that the intrusion had become all-encompassing, affecting not only her home but her professional and social life. One evening, Emma decided to confront the fear directly. She positioned herself near her living room window, observing the building across the street. The rain streaked the glass, casting shadows that made the Watcher's presence difficult to detect, yet she remained alert. For hours she watched and waited, her body tense, ready to act at the first sign of movement. And then she saw it. A faint figure standing motionless, watching her as she had been watched countless times before. The Watcher had returned, deliberate and unyielding. Emma felt a surge of panic, but she also felt a spark of determination. This time, she would not simply react. She would respond. She recorded the figure with her phone, documenting their presence, noting details, height, posture, timing. Every observation was an assertion of control, a refusal to be a passive participant in the game. The Watcher's gaze lingered for a moment before retreating, a silent acknowledgement of her awareness. By now, Emma's world had narrowed to patterns, shadows, and signs. Every sound, movement, and message was analyzed for intent. Her friends and family noticed her withdrawal, and Leah grew increasingly worried. "Emma, you can't keep living like this," she said one evening. "You need help, or this will consume you." Emma understood the truth in those words, but she also recognized that the Watcher's obsession had made leaving or seeking help risky. Every decision was a potential lever for the Watcher to manipulate. The escalation reached a critical point one night when Emma found a small figurine on her balcony, carefully positioned and clearly visible from her window. It was a grotesque miniature, not threatening in itself, but symbolic, a message that she was being observed even in spaces she considered private. The realization left her shaken. The watcher was no longer content with mere observation. They were orchestrating moments to provoke fear and test her limits. As the chapter draws to a close, Emma begins to see the pattern of escalation clearly. The watcher is methodical, patient, and obsessive, using subtle psychological tactics to dominate her perception of safety. Fear is no longer abstract. It is deliberate, invasive, and constant. And yet amid the terror, Emma feels the first stirrings of resolve. She will not be broken. She will learn, adapt, and confront the watcher on her own terms. Perfect. Let's continue with Chapter 3, Investigation of the Watcher in the Window, written in a suspenseful, realistic style, aligned in paragraphs, around 1,500 words, ready for narration. Emma's fear had transformed into determination. The previous week had shown her that passivity would only embolden the watcher. Each shadow, note, and subtle intrusion was a reminder that her life had been penetrated in ways she had once considered impossible. She could no longer rely solely on observation. She needed information, evidence, and a plan. Her first step was to document everything meticulously. Emma began a dedicated notebook, recording times of sightings, details of messages, the positions of objects, and any unusual events. Every observation was logged: the weather, the lighting, the presence of neighbors, and even her own state of mind. She noted the timing of the watcher's appearance, searching for patterns that might reveal their habits or identity. Hours were spent cross-referencing notes with her security camera footage, a process that was exhausting but necessary. The more Emma analyzed, the more she realized that the watcher's methods were precise. The person was not random or impulsive. They were calculating, patient, and highly observant. Every intrusion, every subtle provocation, was designed to elicit a specific response, testing her reactions, her routines, and her psychological resilience. Emma understood that the stakes had escalated beyond simple surveillance. This was a game of power, where fear itself was a weapon. Emma decided to expand her investigation beyond her apartment. She began observing the building across the street more systematically. Using a pair of binoculars, she noted comings and goings, patterns of lighting, and movements of people within the units. Each detail was a potential clue. She started taking photographs, layering timestamps and annotations, building a visual map of the watcher's environment. Hours of quiet observation became a ritual, a tense dance in which she tried to anticipate the watcher's next move without revealing her own attention. Her professional skills became an asset. Emma worked in marketing, but her analytical abilities transferred perfectly to this personal investigation. She began studying behavioral patterns, thinking like someone who sought to manipulate and observe. The watcher had created an invisible cage, but by understanding the rules of this dark game, Emma gained leverage. Each observation was a step toward control, each note a piece of a puzzle she was determined to solve. One evening, Emma noticed a subtle anomaly, a shadow moving inconsistently with other lights in the building. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but to her trained eye it suggested that the watcher was not confined to a single apartment across the street. There were signs of mobility, careful timing, and adaptability. The watcher was learning from her responses, evolving with each interaction. The realization made Emma's pulse quicken. She knew that patience and precision would be crucial. A single mistake could provoke a reaction she was unprepared for. Determined to uncover more, Emma began discreetly speaking with neighbors. She asked casual questions about new residents, maintenance schedules, and unusual activity without revealing her fears. Most neighbors were unaware of anything out of the ordinary, but one older man mentioned a tenant who often spent long hours staring at windows, particularly in the evening. The detail was minor but significant. Emma recorded it, sensing that small pieces of information could connect to a larger picture. Digital investigation became the next focus. Emma reviewed her online accounts, checking for unauthorized access, suspicious emails, and unusual social media activity. She discovered a few anomalies: emails opened that she had not read, subtle changes in notifications, and IP addresses that did not correspond to her devices. Whoever the watcher was, they had access not only to physical spaces, but digital ones as well. Emma realized the danger was multidimensional. Isolation alone would not protect her. The investigation grew more personal when she discovered that some of the notes left under her door contained information about her routines that even close friends could not know. The watcher had knowledge of her habits and movements that suggested prior observation or research. Fear surged, but alongside it came clarity. The intrusion was not random, and the identity of the watcher was deliberate. This was someone who had invested time, intelligence, and patience into creating an elaborate psychological hold over her life. Emma began creating a strategy for confrontation. She would need to lure the watcher into revealing themselves, but in a controlled environment. She considered possibilities carefully, setting up cameras in visible areas, leaving subtle traps that would provoke the watcher into action, and documenting every reaction. Each plan required meticulous preparation, timing, and precision. One wrong move could escalate the situation dangerously, but she understood that inaction was not an option. The next night, Emma set her first test. She left her blinds slightly open, positioned her camera, and created a subtle disturbance on the balcony, an item deliberately placed where it could be observed. Hours passed in tense silence. Finally, a figure appeared across the street, pausing briefly as though acknowledging her manipulation. Emma recorded the moment, noting posture, height, and movement patterns. For the first time, she felt a small measure of control. The watcher had responded, and she now had evidence. Encouraged but wary, Emma continued her investigation over the following days. She cross-referenced movement patterns with maintenance schedules, apartment logs, and public records, slowly constructing a profile of potential suspects. The process was painstaking, requiring observation at all hours, careful note-taking, and constant vigilance. Yet each discovery brought clarity, and clarity brought confidence. She was no longer simply reacting, she was analyzing, anticipating, and preparing. Throughout this investigation, Emma's emotional state was a fragile balance. Fear remained ever present, but determination had taken root. Sleep was still interrupted, and simple tasks felt burdened by vigilance. Yet she was growing stronger psychologically. She realized that the watcher's greatest power was not merely observation, it was the ability to erode her sense of safety and autonomy. By reclaiming that autonomy through investigation, she was gradually undermining the watcher's influence. The climax of this chapter arrives with a discovery that sends shivers down her spine. Reviewing her notes one night, Emma noticed a pattern. The watcher's appearances corresponded with a series of small disturbances in nearby apartments, all originating from units within a specific wing of the building across the street. The realization narrowed the field significantly. For the first time, she could focus on a potential suspect rather than a broad, faceless presence. Perfect. Let's move on to Chapter 4. Psychological Pressure of the Watcher in the Window, written in a suspenseful, realistic style, aligned in paragraphs, around 1,500 words, ready for narration. Psychological pressure. By the time the fourth week of surveillance arrived, Emma's life had transformed entirely. Sleep had become elusive. Her days were punctuated by sudden alarms of anxiety, and every routine activity carried the potential for observation. The watcher's presence had evolved from subtle glimpses to deliberate psychological intrusion. Notes, shadows, and objects manipulated in her apartment now created a pervasive atmosphere of tension. Emma noticed that the Watcher's tactics had grown more calculated. The timing of appearances was no longer random. They appeared at moments she felt most secure, demonstrating an understanding of her emotional state. A cup left slightly askew on the kitchen counter, a flicker of lights in the building across the street, or the faint movement of curtains were all methods of provocation. Each act was designed to remind Emma that she was being studied, evaluated, and manipulated. The psychological pressure began to invade her professional life. At work, Emma found it difficult to focus. Even routine tasks, such as preparing marketing reports or attending meetings, were interrupted by intrusive thoughts. She imagined eyes watching her from distant buildings, considered the possibility of hidden cameras, and replayed past encounters in vivid detail. Paranoia was no longer a fleeting emotion. It had become a constant state of consciousness. Emma's friends and family noticed her growing withdrawal. Leah, her closest confidant, visited frequently, expressing concern over Emma's increasing isolation. "You can't keep living like this," Leah warned one evening. "It's changing you. You're becoming consumed by fear." Emma understood the truth in those words, but the reality was undeniable. Her life had been infiltrated by a calculated, patient observer who refused to reveal themselves. She had no choice but to endure and adapt. The escalation reached a new level when Emma began receiving personalized messages that indicated knowledge of her daily routines. Some were subtle, such as references to lunch breaks, elevator rides, or the books she read before bedtime. Others were more intrusive, mentioning events she had assumed were private, known only to her closest friends. The psychological impact was profound. Fear intertwined with the realization that this individual had meticulously studied her, learning habits, weaknesses, and triggers. Emma began keeping her apartment in a constant state of vigilance. Lights were left on at random intervals to disrupt potential observation. Security cameras monitored every entrance, and doors were double-checked multiple times each day. Despite her precautions, she could not escape the sense of being watched. The Watcher had created a persistent, omnipresent tension that affected every aspect of her existence. Her sleep was frequently interrupted by vivid dreams of being followed. In these dreams, shadows moved just beyond her perception, always watching, always patient. She awoke in cold sweats, heart racing, unable to distinguish between nightmare and reality. The psychological pressure began to manifest physically. Tension headaches, constant fatigue, and a gnawing sense of dread that never fully lifted. The Watcher's methods grew increasingly subtle and inventive. One morning, Emma discovered a series of faint marks on the balcony floor, traces of mud that did not belong to her or any neighbor. Small footprints, carefully placed, suggested that someone had been there while she was away. The evidence was almost imperceptible, yet it conveyed a clear message. No place was truly safe. Her sanctuary had been violated in ways both invisible and deliberate. At the same time, Emma noticed unusual activity in the building across the street. Windows that had remained dark for weeks now flickered on at odd hours. Shadows moved in unusual patterns, sometimes standing still for long intervals, as though waiting for her to observe. The Watcher had evolved from a passive observer into an active manipulator of the environment, using space, light, and time to instill unease. Desperate to maintain some control, Emma developed strategies to counteract the psychological manipulation. She began practicing mindfulness, attempting to separate fear from fact. Every sighting or message was analyzed critically, cataloged, and compared against prior observations. She created hypothetical scenarios to anticipate potential actions of the Watcher, seeking to regain agency in a world that had been quietly invaded. Yet even with these precautions, Emma felt her mental state fraying. Isolation had become almost total. Social interactions were limited to brief conversations with Leah or work colleagues. Public outings were calculated and deliberate, always accompanied by awareness of her surroundings. Even the simplest decisions, ordering coffee, checking mail, or walking to the grocery store, were filtered through the lens of potential observation. The culmination of psychological pressure occurred one evening when Emma returned from work to find her apartment rearranged. Objects were slightly shifted, personal items moved without explanation. At first it seemed minor, almost benign, yet the effect was profound. Emma realized that the watcher was testing her, provoking a reaction. The intrusion was no longer merely external. It was psychological warfare, a calculated manipulation designed to destabilize her sense of reality. Determined not to succumb, Emma escalated her countermeasures. She set up additional cameras recording every angle of her apartment, while simultaneously documenting her observations of the building across the street. Each detail became a piece of evidence. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every subtle shift was cataloged and analyzed. Emma understood that survival required both vigilance and strategy, combining observation with psychological resilience. The pressure continued to escalate as the watcher adapted. Emma began noticing subtle signs of experimentation, shadows that appeared only when she left certain rooms, notes that referenced recent conversations, and faint sounds of movement that seemed designed to provoke anxiety. The psychological game was now fully engaged. Fear, anticipation, and curiosity intermingled, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. By the end of the chapter, Emma's life had become a delicate balance between vigilance and daily function. Fear remained a constant companion, yet determination had emerged as a counterforce. The watcher had succeeded in creating psychological pressure, but Emma's investigative efforts and strategic thinking allowed her to regain a measure of control. She understood that the next phase would require courage, precision, and perhaps confrontation. After weeks of surveillance, documentation, and sleepless nights, Emma had amassed a significant collection of evidence. Photographs, notes, digital logs, and surveillance recordings had provided her with a clearer picture of the watcher's patterns and tactics. The previously invisible presence was now partially revealed through these details, and for the first time, Emma felt a flicker of courage. Fear had been her constant companion, but preparation had begun to replace uncertainty with purpose. Emma's plan for confrontation was careful and deliberate. She would create a controlled environment in which the watcher would have no advantage. The next evening, she positioned cameras in the living room, balcony, and near the entryway. She left subtle cues visible from the building across the street. A slight movement of curtains, an item deliberately placed near the window, and a reflection of light designed to catch attention. Every detail was calculated, meant to provoke a reaction while maintaining her safety. As night fell, Emma waited. Rain streaked the windows, and the city's distant hum created a tense, almost oppressive atmosphere. Hours passed with no sign of the watcher, testing Emma's patience and resolve. Just as she began to question whether the confrontation would succeed, a shadow emerged across the street. A figure stood motionless, observing her apartment. Its presence was unmistakable, deliberate, and patient. Emma's pulse quickened, but she remained focused. This was the moment she had prepared for. She began recording the figure, capturing photographs and video with precise angles. The watcher moved cautiously, pausing to observe reactions to the subtle provocations Emma had arranged. It became clear that they were aware of being watched. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. A tilt of the head, a shift in stance, indicated recognition. Emma felt a mixture of fear and empowerment. The watcher, who had once controlled the narrative, was now reacting to her actions. Emma took the next step: communication. She picked up a marker and wrote a message on a sheet of paper, holding it against the window where the watcher could clearly see it. "I see you. Stop or face consequences." She waited, tense and alert. The figure's response was subtle but chilling. A slow, deliberate wave of the hand signaled acknowledgement, not surrender. It was a silent declaration. The watcher had noticed, and the game was far from over. The confrontation escalated further when Emma decided to create a second controlled test. She left the apartment briefly, walking to the corner store with her phone recording in her coat pocket. The watcher did not immediately follow, but small signs appeared. Lights flickering across the street, shadows moving behind closed curtains, and faint noises that suggested observation. Emma returned home quickly, heart racing, and reviewed the footage. Every subtle movement had been captured, further confirming the watcher's presence and methods. Emma realized that direct confrontation would not be a single act. It would be a process of testing boundaries, observing reactions, and establishing control. She began constructing scenarios to anticipate the watcher's movements, preparing for psychological manipulation and potential escalation. Each step required careful planning, attention to detail, and measured action. Fear remained, but determination now dominated her mindset. The turning point came when Emma decided to confront the watcher in person. Through her documentation and observations, she had narrowed down potential access points and suspected locations. One evening, she arranged a situation in the courtyard, a visible item left near her apartment entrance, a deliberate exposure designed to lure the watcher. Emma waited at a distance, hidden behind parked cars, phone recording every angle. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then a figure appeared, approaching the object deliberately. Emma's heart raced as she observed their cautious movements, noting posture, height, and gait. This was the first close observation in real time. She felt a mixture of fear, anticipation, and resolve. The watcher was no longer an abstract shadow. They were tangible, human, and fully present. Emma's presence did not go unnoticed. The watcher paused, looking directly toward her hiding place. A faint movement, a tilt of the head, suggested recognition. Emma felt a surge of adrenaline. This confrontation was no longer solely about observation. It was a psychological duel, a contest of awareness, control, and courage. Every gesture mattered. Every glance carried significance. The watcher then acted unexpectedly. Instead of retreating or fleeing, they engaged in deliberate manipulation, moving toward the object, pausing, then retreating, creating tension, and testing Emma's reactions. She remained hidden, recording every movement. The realization dawned. The watcher thrived on anticipation, on fear, on the slow unraveling of psychological composure. Confrontation was a battle of wits as much as presence. Emma's careful planning and patience paid off. By documenting and observing the watcher's movements, she began to see weaknesses, patterns, and limitations. The figure's movements were methodical, yet predictable in certain intervals. Emma noted these. Preparing a strategy for future encounters. Control was shifting slightly, where once the watcher had dominated the environment, Emma was beginning to reclaim agency. This chapter also marks a subtle psychological turning point for Emma. While fear remained, she experienced empowerment through preparation, observation, and deliberate action. The watcher's ability to instill terror had limits. Vigilance, strategy, and courage began to counterbalance the oppressive presence. Emma was learning to navigate the psychological game, anticipating actions and reclaiming her autonomy. By the end of the night, Emma had gathered substantial evidence, photographs, video, and detailed notes on the watcher's behavior, movements, and likely locations. She realized that direct confrontation was not a single act of courage, but a sustained, calculated effort. Fear was unavoidable, but preparedness transformed it, from paralysis into controlled action. The confrontation in the courtyard had left Emma both exhausted and alert. Fear remained, but so did a growing determination. She had documented patterns, captured movements on camera, and noted subtle details that suggested careful planning on the part of the watcher. Yet despite all this preparation, a deeper truth lay hidden, one that no amount of observation could have fully uncovered. Emma began reviewing her accumulated evidence with renewed focus. The photographs, videos, and notes had painted a picture of a meticulous, patient observer, but anomalies began to emerge. Small details, objects positioned with precision, subtle gestures, and cryptic notes suggested a familiarity that went beyond casual surveillance. Whoever the watcher was, they knew Emma intimately. Every action, every routine, every response had been studied carefully over weeks. She cross-referenced patterns with public records, apartment directories, and tenant histories. One name repeatedly surfaced: a man who had previously resided in the building across the street. He had a history of obsessive behavior, documented incidents of stalking, and prior restraining orders filed by former acquaintances. Emma's heart pounded as she realized that the watcher's presence was not random. The intrusion was deliberate, personal, and deeply rooted in the past. The revelation became clearer when Emma discovered a connection between the watcher and a former colleague. Small hints within the messages and notes suggested knowledge of her personal history, conversations, and experiences that only someone who had been close to her could know. The watcher had spent months, possibly years, studying Emma, tracking her movements, and understanding her habits. This was not simply an opportunistic observer. It was someone with an intimate, obsessive fixation. Emma's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. The watcher's behavior was methodical, combining psychological manipulation, surveillance, and subtle provocation. They were not merely observing, they were controlling, shaping, and testing Emma's reactions. The previous weeks of fear and anxiety had been orchestrated to study her responses, to measure her resilience, and perhaps to draw her into a more direct interaction. The most shocking element came when Emma reviewed footage from a security camera positioned at the entrance of her building. She noticed a figure lingering near her door, deliberately avoiding detection by neighbors while leaving subtle signs of presence. The individual's posture, gait, and clothing suggested careful planning, yet also revealed moments of nervous hesitation. The watcher was skilled but not infallible, a human being with patterns and weaknesses. Emma confronted the emotional weight of the revelation. The watcher's obsession was personal, dangerous, and disturbingly intelligent. Every note, movement, and shadow had been carefully calculated to instill fear while demonstrating control. Emma realized that understanding motive was as critical as documenting evidence. The person watching her had a purpose beyond simple intrusion. The game she had been forced into was one of dominance, psychological experimentation, and obsession. Determined to confront this truth fully, Emma expanded her investigation to include digital traces, IP logs, metadata from emails, and subtle clues within messages provided additional insight into the watcher's identity. The individual had not only physical access to observation points, but had infiltrated digital spaces, subtly tracking communications and activity. Emma's meticulous record-keeping now revealed a comprehensive picture of the watcher's capabilities and intentions. As the layers of revelation unfolded, Emma's fear transformed into cautious empowerment. Knowledge of the watcher's identity, habits, and obsessions provided leverage. She understood the patterns, the triggers, and the methods used to manipulate her. The psychological pressure, while still present, was now accompanied by clarity. Fear remained a tool of the watcher, but awareness and preparation became tools of her own. The revelation reached its most profound moment when Emma discovered a personal connection. The watcher had a past intertwined with someone she had once trusted, a former friend whose obsession had gone unnoticed until now. The signs had been subtle. Brief comments in conversations, seemingly random gestures, and a fascination with details of Emma's life. The obsessive behavior that had escalated into stalking had roots in personal familiarity, making the intrusion all the more disturbing. Emma now understood the full scope of the danger. The watcher's fixation was deliberate, rooted in a combination of personal obsession, intelligence, and patience. The psychological game had been designed to erode her confidence, manipulate her routines, and instill persistent fear. The revelation was terrifying, yet it provided a path forward. Knowledge of motive and identity offered the first opportunity to reclaim agency and consider resolution. Faced with this truth, Emma began planning her next moves. Direct confrontation, legal action, and continued surveillance were all part of the strategy. She considered involving authorities carefully, balancing the need for safety with the risk of provoking further attention. Each step required calculation, courage, and precision. The revelation had illuminated the problem, but action would define the outcome. The watcher, for all their skill and cunning, had overlooked a crucial element: Emma's determination. The psychological pressure that had once been overwhelming was now tempered by strategic planning, observation, and anticipation. She understood the methods, motives, and vulnerabilities of the watcher, and this knowledge shifted the balance. Fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a tool to sharpen focus, guide strategy, and prepare for confrontation. By the end of the chapter, Emma had gathered sufficient evidence to confront the watcher decisively. Photographs, videos, notes, and digital logs painted a comprehensive picture of obsession, manipulation, and intent. She understood the stakes, the risks, and the patterns that had previously governed her fear. Knowledge had replaced uncertainty, and clarity had replaced paralysis. The revelation had transformed terror into strategy, and Emma was ready for the final confrontation. Perfect. Let's conclude the story with Chapter 7, Resolution of the Watcher in the Window, written in suspenseful, realistic style, aligned in paragraphs, around 1,500 words, ready for narration. Chapter 7, Resolution. Narrator. Welcome back to Ashen Truths, TV. In the last chapter, Emma Carter uncovered the chilling identity and motives of the Watcher. Tonight the story reaches its climax as Emma confronts the threat fully and takes control of her life once more. Emma spent the morning reviewing every detail she had gathered over weeks of surveillance, analysis, and investigation. Photographs, videos, notes, and digital logs formed a complete picture of the Watcher's obsessive behavior. She now knew who had invaded her life, how they had done it, and what their patterns and methods were. The fear that had once paralyzed her had been replaced with determination and a plan of action. The first step was to secure her apartment. Emma installed additional locks, reinforced window latches, and connected a network of security cameras to monitor every angle. She created multiple backups of all evidence, both physical and digital, to ensure that no information could be lost. Each precaution was deliberate, designed to protect her from further intrusion while creating a controlled environment for confrontation. The authorities. She presented her evidence meticulously. Next, Emma contacted, documenting every appearance, note, and movement of the Watcher. Law enforcement was initially skeptical of the subtlety of the stalking, but as she detailed the patterns, threats, and surveillance, they recognized the seriousness of the situation. A restraining order was quickly obtained, and police began monitoring the building across the street for suspicious activity. Despite legal protection, Emma understood that resolution required more than paperwork. She needed to confront the watcher, to assert control in the physical and psychological realm. Using the information she had collected, she devised a strategy. She arranged for a controlled encounter in a public space, a location where the watcher could not manipulate surroundings or isolate her. Every step was calculated, designed to minimize risk while maximizing leverage. The day of the confrontation arrived. Emma's heart raced, but she felt steady and focused. The city around her bustled with indifferent movement, yet she knew the watcher would be watching, calculating, anticipating her responses. Cameras were positioned strategically, capturing the environment, while friends waited discreetly nearby to provide support if necessary. Emma felt a sense of empowerment she had not experienced since the beginning of the ordeal. As predicted, the watcher appeared. Their approach was cautious, deliberate, but the evidence and preparations Emma had amassed left them without advantage. Emma stepped forward calmly, holding her head high, and confronted the figure directly. Words were exchanged sparingly, but the message was clear. The intrusion was over, and the power had shifted. The watcher's methods, once subtle and manipulative, were now powerless against careful documentation, preparation, and legal support. Law enforcement intervened immediately after the encounter. The watcher, identified and confronted with evidence, was taken into custody. Charges of stalking, harassment, and invasion of privacy were filed. The psychological game that had dominated Emma's life for weeks came to a definitive end, and the control that had once belonged to the watcher now rested firmly with her. Emma's life slowly began to return to normal. The apartment, once a place of fear and surveillance, became a sanctuary once again. Daily routines resumed with a new awareness of personal boundaries and safety measures. The experience had left scars, fear, anxiety, and vigilance, but it had also strengthened her resilience, analytical skills, and ability to confront challenges directly. The resolution also brought reflection. Emma realized that fear had been both an obstacle and a teacher. It forced her to observe, analyze, and act with precision. Each step she had taken, from documenting patterns to confronting the watcher, was a demonstration of courage and strategy. The experience, while harrowing, had revealed her capacity for endurance, intelligence, and control under pressure. Friends and family rallied around Emma, offering support, encouragement, and reassurance. Leah, who had urged her to seek help early on, became a constant presence, celebrating each milestone of recovery. Emma's professional life resumed, now infused with a heightened sense of awareness and strategic thinking. The ordeal, though traumatic, had imparted in vigilance, resilience, and personal empowerment, lessons she would carry forward. In the final moments, Emma returned to her apartment at night, looking out across the city. The lights of Chicago shimmered in the distance, ordinary and familiar once more. Shadows that had once represented fear now seemed simply reflections of the city's life. Emma understood that the world could contain danger, but preparedness, awareness, and courage transformed fear from a weapon into a tool. She had survived, learned, and reclaimed her life. The story of Emma Carter serves as a stark reminder. Vigilance, strategy, and courage are essential when facing unseen threats. Fear can be manipulated, but evidence, preparation, and resolve can restore control. Emma's experience shows that even in the darkest moments, knowledge and careful action can provide safety, empowerment, and clarity. Thank you for watching this episode on Ashen Truths TV. Where are you watching from? What city and country? Share in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe and like our channel to support more stories like Emma's. Remember, the truth may be hidden in shadows, but courage and awareness can bring it into the light.